On this edition of FedGov Today, DARPA's drive to shore up the energy supply chain. The White House's fraud task force gets down to business and say goodbye to at least one federal office building. Welcome to FedGov Today in Washington, D.C., on YouTube and around the world on the American Forces Network. I'm Francis Rose. A new energy development program at DARPA is drawing interest from the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. The Fleetwood program will work on converting biological material into energy sources. William Moundfield is the Fleetwood program manager at DARPA. William, welcome. It's great to have you on the program. What do you think is drawing this interest from the services and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency to what you're doing, and what are you doing exactly in the Fleetwood program?
So I think a lot of it stems from these services looking at future warfighting concepts and how we need many of our materials, but that we may be operating in an environment that we refer to as contested logistics. And so that's where our current modality of moving materials in theater to our warfighters may be inhibited. And so where can we actually pull those materials from? And so in conversations with them, we explored where we might be able to source many of those things. And so one of the areas might be from biomass. Biomass can mean many things. In this case, it's referring to both agricultural and forestry waste, which is globally distributed. There are gigatons of carbon, if we look at it on a carbon basis, available in the world from biomass. And so if you look at that in terms of global oil output, it's many times over the amount of oil that's produced on a carbon basis. The problem with that is that it's distributed. If we think about, let's say, South China Sea, Indonesia produces around 150 million tons of agricultural waste every year that's just burned or left on the field to lie fallow. And so that could be converted into the entirety of the U.S. military's need for fuel and chemicals for a future operation.
The one particular element that I read about is lignin. How is that different than, and trying to extract that, different from other biomass projects that the department's undertaken?
So lignin is this really difficult to process biopolymer. It's nature's largest source of aromatic compounds, which make up many of the plastics and other materials that we use today, and it's what gives trees and plants their structure. And so it's this really nice polymer that nature has developed, but it has provided a lot of challenges in how do you process it. If we look at the pulp and paper industry, they discard lignin as they call it black liquor, and so it's extracted out of the process, the paper making process, and burned for waste heat. And it really has been regarded as having almost no value because the previous research efforts have not really tried to extract that in its native form.
What's the process that you're undertaking to try to figure out how to make that thing that people thought was unusable, usable now? So part of that comes from, and this stems from somewhat from my background, is catalysis. And so a catalyst is something that allows us to convert material A to material B. It's what underpins our global chemical refining infrastructure. And so what really the Fleetwood program is hoping to do is to allow performers to develop those materials that are required, one, to break the lignin down, how do we get it out of the biomass, and then also how do we convert it from its innate form into valuable materials. So the conversion process, I love the way you describe this, creating robust and novel catalysts to convert the processed lignin into specific high-value products. Why those words to describe what you're doing? So in previous research efforts that have been funded by the NSF and the Department of Energy, they've targeted very specific products. And so we really want to open that up to give us more options for what we can provide for the warfighter and where can we source those materials from. Now, there are many different types of biomass. You may be familiar with corn. There's corn in the U.S., there's rice, there's wood, but globally there are things like bananas, coconuts. Those have not been explored for how do we actually break them down. We will inevitably need new catalysts, new materials that can break these down efficiently. And we may discover these and they may be useful in an academic sense, but now being DARPA, we want to move these forward and actually put them into an industrially relevant formulation so that they could be employed in a future effort. And understanding what all the potential sources are around the world is what makes this a supply chain gain for the department. Am I reading that right?
Precisely, and so you could envision this type of global biomass map, and so you could understand which types of biomass are available in which regions and what products they are best suited to make. Now, there may be products that you need that are maybe lower efficiency to actually produce, but they still would be possible, and that's part of the other parts of the program that we want to undertake, is understanding which routes are possible, what materials can be actually produced from the varied types of biomass that are available globally.
You had an industry day on this a couple of weeks ago. What did you learn from industry, and what was the message you wanted to convey to them about what you're undertaking with the Fleetwood program?
So the industry day was primarily targeted at teaming, and so this is a very difficult challenge that we think will require a multidisciplinary approach. And so it really was to get the information out to both academics and industry folks and see what they were bringing to the table. And so we allowed them to do lightning talks. They pitched their ideas, and they were already forming teams, which was great to see, along with that really robust response. I
read a successful Fleetwood program, according to DARPA, will transform the bioeconomy. What's the bioeconomy look like today, and how will your program, if it's successful, transform that bioeconomy?
So today, the bioeconomy, you have some bespoke products that are currently produced. Many of them, like xanthan gum, is produced by Archer Daniels Midland, so they're one of the largest biorefiners in the U.S. And so many of those are produced at scale, but again, very specific products. So we would like to, if Fleetwood is successful, to expand this out to encompass many of the chemicals that we currently rely on foreign sources for, and also create this domestic resilient network of chemical manufacturing for many different applications in the U.S.
How will you know that the program is on track the way that you want it to go throughout the life cycle of it? Or how will you decide at some point, well, maybe we need to reshape the way that we're doing this?
So as with any DARPA program, we have quantitative metrics that we assess our performers against. Those have been set in how do we extract the biomass efficiently, and then also how do we convert it, with also an additional aspect of economic viability. And so performers will need to evaluate their chosen routes and see how those will actually produce materials that are of value, both for the department and also for civilian applications.
And that you touched on where I wanted to go next, which is how much of this do you anticipate in the long term being a dual use capability, the way the Secretary's talked about on a number of occasions?
Much of it. And so that's where, if you think about the plastics that we use, many of those are the same plastics that you use for toys, for other useful products that we use every day. You can think of things like carbon fiber. So advanced composites, those are useful, those have a dual use application. And so it's going to enable both our ability to produce those types of resources and materials in theater while also producing them domestically.
Are there elements of what you're doing on this program that either came from other programs that DARPA has operated, or that you think may apply moving forward to what they're doing? Not just the scientific aspects, but the structural aspects of the way you've built the program and so on.
Yes. So if we look at DARPA's previous biomass conversion efforts, you have almost 2 decades ago the Biofuels program. That's really what has stood up the synthetic aviation fuel market. And then you have Living Foundries, which also came out of the Biological Technologies Office. And that kind of explored what is possible to be made with biology. And so this helped kind of guide us in what is still left unanswered, and that's where we're trying to direct the Fleetwood program to.
William, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for the opportunity, Francis.
You can read more about the Fleetwood program on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, the White House's fraud task force gets down to business. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
Innovation doesn't wait, and neither do we. At Maximus, we solve problems, streamlining operations, delivering solutions at speed and scale that drive measurable results. From strategy to execution, we simplify complexity, building trust through expertise and innovative technology. Every service, every time. Efficient government delivered. We don't follow innovation, we drive it. Maximus.
TruckVia modernizes work processes with a secure, easy-to-use solution to track and automate operations in one place. From staffing and tracking large projects and to managing facilities, assets, and compliance. Teams can modernize processes instantly, work online or offline, and generate accurate reporting without added IT burden. Ensures confidentiality, integrity, and availability ideal for government CUI data in the cloud. One system replaces many. Track via modern, mobile, mission ready.
Welcome back. The White House's Task Force on Fraud is up and running. The chairman of the task force, Vice President Vance, convened the first meeting of the task force last week. The chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, Andrew Ferguson, is the vice chair of the task force. Robert Shea is CEO of Gov Navigators. He's former Associate Director for Administration and Government Performance at the Office of Management and Budget. Robert, thanks for being on the program again. What's your takeaway from the first meeting of the board? What did you hear come out of it that you think really will make a difference to the way agencies work on fraud?
Well, the first takeaway is that they had the meeting, right? The administration appointed a task force headed by the vice president. That's got its own heft. They appointed an executive director with deep Department of Justice experience. So, and brought a cross-section of the federal government together to talk about what's a serious problem. GAO estimates the extent of fraud losses that the federal government suffers annually, upwards of between $250 and $500 billion. The economy of small countries. So the fact that this kind of attention is being brought to the problem, I think, should potentially serve us really well.
Is there a potential change because of the work of the task force for the way that agencies already are working on fighting fraud?
I do. Remember early in the administration, the president issued executive orders on fraud that required greater data sharing, more reporting, better collaboration across the government to fight fraud. But we haven't seen as much progress as I think we would have hoped. So, those who think they're operating a program that is safe from fraud are wrong. Fraudsters are evolving at such a pace that we need to put as many resources as we can collaborating together jointly to solve the problem.
And that gets to where I wanted to go next. Fraud seems to be running on a parallel track to cyber in the way that it seems to be easier and easier for the bad guys to get ahead of the good guys. Am I reading that right? Or are there technological solutions that may help to close that gap too?
Yes and yes. The evolution of technology, especially artificial intelligence, means that those techniques that needed to be conducted manually now can be done so much more quickly and so much with much greater sophistication, and bureaucracies are traditionally unable to keep up. Our friends at Shakeup, they're an identity verification firm, recently put out a report that talked about identity firms. These are people whose sole job it is to nurture false identities for the purposes of scamming people, applying for benefits. Not every federal agency is the same with respect to the controls they have in place and the evolving fraud risk management to stay ahead of that. Hopefully this fraud task force will bring lift everybody's boat to fight this very rapidly evolving threat.
When you and I have talked in the past about financial management issues, one of them that I remember in particular was improper payments. You talked about the possibility that the numbers that we know of could go up, sometimes dramatically, before they go down, just because people are starting to look a lot more closely. Is that possible here too?
Well, unfortunately, I think I told you that in 1999.
It's been a while.
And it's been, the measured improper payments exceed $1 trillion over that period of time. So, yes, the numbers that we count will go up, but hopefully so will the amount of fraud we prevented. SBA is preventing hundreds of billions of dollars in fraud today because of the lessons it learned through COVID. If we can learn those lessons, then the the score sheet will show not only amount of fraud detected, but a greater and greater amount prevented.
You work with agencies all across government. What is your sense of the sharing of those leading practices, as GAO calls them, that organizations like SBA and others have learned that other agencies could learn from to be able to fight fraud?
I don't think it's good, frankly. I think, believe it or not, and I take some responsibility for this, we've passed law after law requiring agencies to do stuff to bring more attention to the problem. You yourself said that the reporting of the problem may show a greater extent of the problem. Those efforts have led to a compliance mentality. So if we conduct a risk assessment or estimate the extent of the problem, to some extent, agencies think that's enough. It's not. And what I think we need to see is a greater understanding of what good looks like in fraud prevention. Hats off to Treasury for standing up and maturing Do Not Pay. This is a tool available to state and local governments as much as it is to the federal government. You need to make sure that you're using that and other tools before you pay people to ensure you're not giving tax dollars to fraudsters.
We have about a minute left. Long term, is the amount of fraud going down the only measure? Is it the best measure? What else should people pay attention to?
The best measure is the amount of dollars being invested in high-performing programs. Every dollar wasted to fraud means those programs go without. Tax dollars, taxes go up, the debt and deficit continue to rise. I think a dashboard of those metrics can give us a fuller picture of how well we're doing in this arena.
Always great to have you here, Robert. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Francis.
You can read more about the Fraud Task Force on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. Up next, say goodbye to at least one federal office building. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
An executive sponsor who can be a loud vocal cheerleader for the technology, who can really drive home the value proposition to federal employees, because as federal employees, we don't like change a lot often. And AI is going to change how your agency operates. It's going to change your business processes. And as an employee, you need to understand why that is and why is this a good thing that this is happening.
There's another big thing that is important, which is around how they want to integrate with their existing systems. And so at the end of the day, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of AI applications involves integration with a case management system or a records management system, some existing system in place. And so how is that integration going to happen? Are we going to use APIs? Are we going to use something like model context protocols? So those are some of the early decisions around architecture that agencies need to make.
Welcome back. The General Services Administration says it has a deal to sell its former regional office building in Washington. Dalian Development will pay $24 million for the building. The Wall Street Journal reports the company says it will convert the empty building into a mix of apartments, retail, and potentially a museum. Norman Dong is partner at FD Stonewater. He's former commissioner of the Public Building Service at GSA. Norm, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
You wrote about this recently in the Washington Business Journal, and you wrote, the need for speed for disposing of these buildings should not come at the expense of maximizing the full value and development potential of these assets. How do you walk that balance in the Public Building Service of determining when's a good time to move a building, especially given some of the market conditions that exist today?
First of all, let's give credit where credit's due. It's great that GSA is moving with a lot more determination and resolve to dispose of these buildings. For years and years and years, the federal government had a little bit of a hoarder mentality where it kind of delayed action. So now you're seeing action. So that's a good thing. However, what we're seeing is GSA is kind of doing a piecemeal approach by selling these buildings one by one. without considering a larger plan for redeveloping the entire neighborhood.
So that neighborhood in particular is interesting because it covers the stretch from the National Mall all the way down to the waterfront, that part of the southwest quadrant. What does, in your mind, what's GSA's role in developing that kind of plan, and who else should be involved in putting a plan together that makes sense for that part of the city?
Sure. If you look back at how GSA has considered its presence in Washington, D.C. and other cities, it's recognized how its presence can be a force multiplier for local development. And you've seen many examples where GSA has worked in collaboration with the D.C. government and other city governments to really be thoughtful in terms of, planning its investments. So if you look at the Navy Yard and the Department of Transportation moving down there, if you look at NOMA and you look at the EEOC headquarters there, in both cases, GSA worked very closely with the district to think about the larger neighborhood impact. So what we're seeing now is, okay, the reverse should be true as we think about federal disinvestment and the federal government disposing of these properties. You need to think about what the larger plan is for that neighborhood and how the federal action supports that plan.
I want to go back to the talk about determining value. There's been some criticism of GSA because of the price that the company paid for the regional office building in particular. There are a lot of factors, though, that I imagine go into that. How it pencils out for the potential purchaser and so on is one. What are all the factors that go into determining what a good deal is for the government, what a good deal is for the taxpayer, but also what a good deal is for the person or group that's buying the building?
So put yourself in the shoes of the purchaser here. You've got to think about the building and the amount of capital repairs it needs. You also have to think about the risk and uncertainty of redeveloping this site. The developer is buying these buildings with no rental income. And it may be years and years before you start to see that revenue from rental income. So there's that. There's also questions about what you can do in terms of historic preservation, constraints, and environmental issues. And again, it kind of comes back to the risk and uncertainty that a purchaser faces if there's no larger plan and vision for the larger neighborhood.
Does that larger plan, if there's a plan for the entire area, does that add value potentially then, make it more interesting to a potential buyer?
Absolutely. You've seen in other examples with the Southeast Federal Center by the ballpark and with the wharf at the Southwest waterfront, where the district worked collaboratively with the federal government to kind of send strong signals to the market in terms of future use for those sites.
You cited in your piece in the Business Journal the Georgetown West heating plant, sold in 2013. I remember when that sold, people like you, it wasn't you, but people who are real estate professionals in the federal government, absolutely flabbergasted that the deal even ever went through because of that hoarder mentality that you referenced earlier in our conversation. But you cite in this piece, because of development challenges, it took 10 years. It was just 2023 before work finally really got underway in redeveloping that site. How do you see getting out of that cycle, and who are the stakeholders that will help people get out of that cycle, which I imagine would then make these properties even more valuable to people?
Yeah, you need to think about two sides of the equation. One is, what does the federal government need to do to dispose of the property? But then once that property is disposed, what is life like for the developer who's got to deal with the zoning issues and the land use approvals, and if there are historic preservation covenants that GSA has applied, then how does that impact what you can do in terms of redeveloping the site? In the case of the West heating plant, GSA had attached a historic preservation encumbrance as part of the sale. It took the developer 10 years to undo that restriction.
And that restriction was not negotiated at the time of the sale of the property? I'm trying to understand what will help.
Yeah. When the GSA decided to sell the property, it indicated as part of the National Historic Preservation Act Section 106 review process that there would be no adverse impact to the historic nature of that structure. So think about it. If you're a developer, that's really tying your hands in terms of what you can do with that property.
And makes it less appealing to for somebody to potentially even buy it in the first place.
Absolutely.
All right. What do you think is a long-term, setting aside the idea of a neighborhood plan for that particular area of Southwest that we've talked about, what's a long-term good outcome for the federal government, for the taxpayer, and for the real estate market broadly with these properties coming onto it, Norm?
I think the approach that we want to see is where the district government and the federal government are speaking with one voice in terms of the future land use for this area, and have developed a unified go-to-market strategy for these properties. GSA makes a decision in terms of what properties to sell, but the district government makes a decision in terms of the future use of those sites. So they should be working together to maximize the redevelopment potential of these properties.
Norm, it's great to have you on the program. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
You can read more about the federal real estate footprint on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. FedGov Today continues in a moment.
Different than traditional, not in basically how it's, but the models are provided, and it's now what is the data that you're actually working with that model with. Whereas before, you did have to provide data, but it was structured. You understood the inputs and outcomes. So when it comes to generative AI, it's more around how do I package knowledge so that I can drive intent, understand intent, and drive outcomes based off of that.
Welcome back. In today's event spotlight, this Wednesday is the Contact Center Transformation Summit that IAC will host. Government and industry leaders will teach you how to turn your agency's contact centers into valuable sources of data that can give you an edge in mission delivery. It's happening Wednesday, April 8th at the Carasoft Conference and Collaboration Center in Reston. You can learn more about the event and register at fedgovtoday.com/events. FedGov Today TV is back next Sunday morning at 10. The Deputy Secretary of Labor and the Chief Human Capital Officer at the Secret Service will be here. I'm Francis Rose. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Have a great week. If you want insights from agency and industry leaders on the latest topics in technology, management, workforce, defense, and acquisition, sign up for the FedGov Today podcast with me, Francis Rose. I release new episodes every Tuesday and Thursday, so you'll stay up to date on the issues that matter most to federal government leaders. Listen at fedgovtoday.com and everywhere you get your shows. Don't miss out on the conversation. Follow the podcast today.